Hello, we're joined today by Lord Boateng, Britain's first black cabinet minister, Britain's first black high commissioner, a politician, a diplomat, a lawyer. Lord Boateng, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be with you.
I wondered if we could start by talking a little bit about how did you become involved in London Line? One thing that I've noticed is that many of the presenters seem to have been recruited from the BBC World Service. How did you become involved?
Well, I won a competition
Oh.
for the Observer of public speaking, and I appeared one Sunday in the Observer newspaper. And then the following day, on the Monday or Tuesday, I got a letter out of the blue asking me whether I'd like to consider being a presenter. Look, I was a poor student on a full grant. I was a we were essentially refugees. We lived in a council estate in Hemel Hempstead, just my mum. My dad was a political prisoner, my mum, myself, and my sister. So if someone out of the blue suddenly offers you opportunity to earn money, you take it. And I did.
Did you know anything about the programme? Because when I've spoken to the other presenters, they said that it was really quite popular in parts of West Africa and they would get a lot of fan mail and so on. Was it a programme you were aware of before you were involved in it? Or
No, I wasn't aware of it. I became rapidly aware of it because as soon as I started doing it, I started getting letters from Ghana. And when I went back to Ghana in what must have been 1970, 73, 73, 72, then I got lots of people stopping me in the streets and in the countryside in my father's village in Tafo in the eastern region, because of course the program didn't just appear on television. It went out and about in the villages too, on film vans. So yeah,
it was a big deal. So I mean, you said you did it obviously for money, but I guess one question or one thing that comes to mind is, did you find it useful? I know you were always interested in drama, so presumably you enjoyed it, but the kind of advocacy and so on, which you make your career as a campaigner and a lawyer, was it helpful for that?
I learnt not to fear the camera, and I learnt to respond to the camera in ways that were positive. I learned how to express myself in camera, on the camera, and you had to. It was interesting because everything was highly scripted.
If the world were the size of this football, the Earth's crust, or the solid outer covering that holds the minerals, would be no thicker than a postage stamp.
So it was no question of your doing impromptu remarks. That wasn't on. You received a script. You had to learn the script. You had, when you arrived at any given location, very rapidly to make some form of relationship with the people who were connected with the London School of Tropical Medicine or the Institute of Forestry or the London School of Fashion. I mean, whatever it was that was being covered on the day. So you would be asking questions. So to ask questions well, you had to have some sort of relationship with the people you were asking them. But it was scripted, and you knew that you were operating in a way that was designed to produce a film that had a message. The message was to get over certain specific pieces of information in a good cause, because invariably these were worthy subjects, and you learned how to be concise. And not to go on, and to get your points over. So did that help me in later life? Of course, I had no inkling then that I was going ever to go into the world of politics, but I knew I was going to be a lawyer, and so self-expression and clarity and anything that improves that's good news. And I learnt a lot from my experience on London Line.
One thing that you've mentioned before, you talked about the script. Did you have any input into the script? Because I think because it's a civil service thing, that there's always a sense that a lot of the script has to be signed off at a very minute level and has to have permissions and so on. Did you have any input? Or
well, I tried to have input because I was concerned to make sure that we had a product that was lively and attractive. And sometimes the civil service language was just so stilted. And you knew it was civil service language because at the end of the scripts, you'd have these little boxes and people had ticked them. So you knew the Foreign and Commonwealth Office had to tick it. You knew if it was a health subject, the Department of Health had to tick it. So it had been through a process. And often it sounded stilted. So you had to try and liven it up a bit. But there was only so far you could go. And if you went too far, then Bill Metcalf or Judy Davidson, someone who was responsible for the end product, would soon let you know, well, actually, no, it doesn't say that, ask it this way. But yeah, you were working for a government civil service outfit, and you were always aware of that.
Could you say a little bit about what it was like being on set making these films? I've heard before they're very strict. It's kind of like move to this point, look at this camera, stay. It was it was quite sort of, there was a huge sense of propriety and so on.
Look, working for the COI, you had a very strong sense of mission there, and also a house style. So you knew that you wanted to get over certain pieces of information. You knew also that the house had its own way of doing things. And all the directors worked to that house style. So you learned, and it helped me a great deal in later life, not just as someone who was interviewed, but also in my life as a broadcaster, because I worked extensively as a broadcaster, both on radio and on TV. You learnt the importance of discipline and focus and of being technically adept. So yeah, there was a mark where you stood, you worked to camera, you learned how to do voiceovers, so how you sounded and the clarity of your expression, bearing in mind that you knew that many of the people who were going to be watching these programs, English was not their first language. So you needed to be clear. And the COI production style expected and demanded that.
One thing that's also come across a lot is friendship groups. So there's clearly a lot of friendships were made on London Line, and these have kind of, been sustained now across several decades. And even at the time, I was looking at the play, the Lion and the Jackal, when it opened. I mean, it was a couple of years before you worked for London Line at Royal Court. It had several London Line presenters starring on stage in that play, which was amazing. Was it important for you in terms of friendship groups?
Well, look, I was 20 when I started. So, for me, it was just so exciting, to be working with Glenna Foster-Jones, who was in Hair, to be working with Jumoke Debayo, who was in an incredible film called the National Health Service. And, you would bump into people while you were filming who Jumoke or Glenna knew, and these were stars. So I felt I was extremely young, and I just felt extremely privileged, and it was fun. I enjoyed it, but it was hard work. You had to put in the time and the attention, and you yourself had to be focused and professional, and that was a good thing. But it was fun to be working with these people who were in their day. I mean, Glenna Foster-Jones and Jumoke Debayo were the two preeminent black women stars of stage and screen at that time, and it was great to be working with them. And I'm still friends with Jumoke. We talk. She's in Australia now. We talk regularly. My wife has become a friend of hers. My children know. I mean, So they were important friendship groups. I was best man to Glenna's brother, Glenna Foster-Jones's brother. So yes, they were strong friendship groups.
I guess we should probably talk about some of the content of the films, and the Minerals film that hopefully we can show clips from. It kind of speaks to the way in which some of those London Line films seem, when you watch them now, very much linked in a point of history which is very much sort of defined by development economics in a sense, and this kind of what I would call like a high modernism. There's lots of films about making concrete hospitals or expanding higher education services and things like that. Were they subjects that you took a personal interest in as well, or did you ever find yourself agreeing or disagreeing with some of the editorial lines?
No, the editorial lines were entirely worthy. Sometimes they were not particularly exciting, but you knew that they had a purpose. And the purpose, frankly, was uplifting and designed to promote development and trade and manufacture and public health. And they were all things that you thought, well, yes, actually, this is good. And for me, I mean, I was christened in the eastern region of Ghana in a rural farming community and in a community where forestry was also important. So when I was filming in the Ashford Forest at the Institute of Forestry Studies or whatever it was called, I knew that actually my relatives in the eastern region would find this film useful. And did that make me feel connected with them and connected with something that was worthwhile? Yes, it did, and I'm very grateful for it. Just as one knew that it was actually rather important that people who were considering studying in Britain were aware of what the implications could be in terms of their own families and their own children. Mm-hmm. Just as it was rather important. And I won't forget this. We did a film at the School of Fashion in Oxford Street. Actually, you wanted to see black designers. You wanted there to be more black fashion models. Marsha Hunt and indeed Glenna herself. These were also fashion icons, and you wanted to see black people, people of African descent, having their talents and skills recognized. So yes, to make a film about that felt actually to me in my early 20s as a student at that stage in my life rather important, and I was glad to be part of that exercise. I never felt, and this is one of the strengths of the COI, I never felt that I was pushing some sort of government political line. That wasn't what the COI was about. The COI was part of a sort of developmental process that was designed to uplift and to take people forward and to build positive relationships. And I think that was one of the strengths of the COI. It wasn't propaganda. If it had been propaganda, then frankly, I don't think, I wouldn't have been a part of it. However helpful it was to have that money on top of my grant and on top of my tiny wages as an article clerk. So, and believe you me, I remember my first wage packet as a trainee lawyer. It was £17.50 a week with luncheon vouchers. Now, if you can get £25 for half a day's work for the COI, I made it a term and condition of my employment by Bernberg's that I was going to get holiday from time to time so I could continue to do it. Because, frankly, I was not only supporting myself, I was contributing towards our family finances. We had nothing. So the COI, for me, it was London line. It was also a lifeline. That was the reality at that time. It was tough. It was hard. But I wouldn't have done it if I'd felt it was, in any sense, propaganda. It was never that. It was about development and about relationships.
No, I think you're right. I think that in some ways that it's a genre that's been forgotten, but there is a distinct difference between public information and state or government news. So those two things are actually quite different. I mean, you talked there about your personal relationship with the subjects a little bit. Obviously, the film that is being digitized is essentially about fostering.
Last year, the total number of overseas students studying full-time in Britain rose by 15% to 95,000.
And it's an extremely interesting film, and it starts with a series of headlines being shown on the screen. And I was just wondering, when you made the film, were you aware that, fostering had become a more contentious issue? I mean, my sort of social history sort of research around it is that the Children's Act had come in, and there was increasing sort of intervention on, are foster mothers good mothers, and do we actually want this?
Bye bye. Bye.
And at the same time, there was a demand from African students and a kind of a cultural tradition that fostering should happen. And these two kind of worlds were colliding a little bit, and the film was trying to help people to make sense of that.
I mean, I was aware that it was becoming an issue. I mean, that film, if my memory serves me well, was 1974?
Yeah.
I, by that time, had just started out, I think, as an article clerk. And I was acutely aware in my field of practice that fostering, and particularly transracial fostering, was becoming problematic. And there was an issue there that needed exploring.
But are you really sure you want to foster this little baby who has just arrived?
This program was about consciousness raising, about making people aware of what the implications were. So it wasn't taking a position one way or the other, but I was acutely aware that this was an important issue. And there were others. I mean, I remember making a film about the black churches and about black theology, and interviewing, if my memory serves me well, Gus John up in Birmingham, Professor Gus John, who of course became an eminent educator and theologian. And these were important issues.
I mean, from what I can make sense of, that the particular film about African student families was made also to be screened at several conferences, particularly in Nigeria in about 74, 75, partly in response to a worry that if you fostered your child with a white working class family, they might be somehow disadvantaged or learn poor English or become less African. And so the film was also partly, I think, to address some of those fears. That's what I've understood.
I mean, what I was aware of that was that some children were, in essence, actually being abandoned. Now, they were being abandoned for perfectly understandable motives from their parents' point of view. The parents were desperate to get an education, and they wanted both parents to have that opportunity to get an education. They couldn't both get an education whilst one of them was looking after the child. So the child was placed in the hands of a foster carer. Now, that was a perfectly rational decision for the benefit of the family, but it did have implications for the child. And I think there was a growing awareness of what those implications were. And one of the implications was that the child became sort of distanced from its parents, from its roots, from its language. And however loving or supportive the parent, the foster parent, they didn't necessarily understand how to deal with issues around a black child's hair.
I notice you haven't been plaiting their hair.
Well, no, it's a little bit beyond me.
Around a black child's skin. Because the reality is that as a black parent, in the cold climate, you've got to ensure that we use cocoa butter, that the skin remains smooth and supple. You want the child's hair to be taken care of, to be plaited, to be cut properly. I remember as a black boy, as a teenager, 16, 17, growing up in Hemel Hempstead. I mean, I used to come into Harlesden to have my hair cut. Come into Euston, get the number 18 bus and go to Harlesden, because so far as the barbers in Hemel were concerned, it was like shearing a sheep. That was the reality. This was life for black kids and youngsters in the 60s and 70s. And these films, of course, touch on that.
I do like the sort of the end. There's a very positive sort of civic group of teenagers all kind of mixing together, and it doesn't seem to be a central state thing. It seems to be a civic group thing. Is that
the role of the state was, if anything, as an enabler? Don't forget, the state enabled community relations councils, a local and national state, enabled community relations councils to come together, to get off the ground, and they did. There was a statutory basis for them, for their funding. But civil society, youth clubs, church youth clubs, non-church youth clubs, provision of that sort was very much part of the voluntary sector, the spirit of volunteering that has always existed in Britain. And so the state was there in terms of Section 11 funding and things like that. But at the end of the day, it was people coming together, determined to make a difference through the community relations councils to shape and improve their lives. It was black people and white people coming together with a specific purpose. And I think the film reflects that, and it shows a very self-confident, aware group of young people, black and white, and certainly, as someone in their early 20s at the time, that spoke to me of the best of my experience. Of course, there was another side that wasn't shown, which was one of continuing overt racism, which is touched on actually, but isn't shown.
When you spoke there about the civic society, it did put me in mind of your future career, as you mentioned Benedict Bernberg and that kind of sort of civil society. I actually see it having a high point in the 70s, although I suppose you would say it goes on, that kind of law for everyone.
I don't think it. I mean, one of the tragedies is that it hasn't gone on.
Yeah.
The reality is that in the 70s and 80s, you had legal aid, you had a law centre movement, which was ensuring that it was possible for ordinary people to access the law and to gain their rights in terms of housing and welfare, and indeed in terms of family and adoption, through the use of the law as a way of developing and enhancing and delivering people's human rights. Now that infrastructure is no longer there.
Actually, there are so many interesting COI films about the North Kensington law, the Citizens Advice Bureau, and this, as you said, this whole wave of institutions, post-60s institutions.
The North Kensington Law Centre was the first law centre. The Paddington Law Centre was the second. After I finished training at Bernberg's, I went on to work at the Paddington Law Centre, and the good thing about the COI. Was that it recorded that, and it reflected it to a wider world. We don't have its equivalent in Britain in the 2020s. It doesn't exist anymore. So whilst there are undoubtedly some good positive things going on, I don't think you find them necessarily picked up in the same way by a non-publicly funded media. There's much more. There's a very different spirit abroad today that is not, in my view, as sort of healthy and liberating in its way as, oddly enough, the COI was, despite the fact that it was an entity of government. It was rooted in a public service tradition.
Obviously, you are someone who spends a lot of time abroad, especially in Africa. Do you have a sense of how Britain's relationship has changed, or whether what sort of role the media is playing in mediating the image of Britain abroad at the moment? Or because you sort of mentioned that the COI, there's a lack, that's a missing element. I was just wondering, what's your impression of how Britain is perceived through the media abroad at the moment?
Well, I think the reality is that we have the overseas service on the radio, which remains, I think, a very potent medium in terms of public international diplomacy, and that has still very much a public service ethos and is a trusted medium. You have BBC World, but they unfortunately they don't have the degree of reach and public funding that they once had. And there are other players now. I mean, Al Jazeera is, if you look at the amount of money that's spent and the depth of reporting and documentary content of Al Jazeera, it outguns now, I'm afraid, both the radio and television offer, publicly funded offer of the UK, and the commercials are just nowhere in terms of the consciousness of the wider world. So for me, the overseas service and BBC World are deserving of greater funding than they get.
So what are the answers to the questions we were asking at the beginning of the programme?
Obviously, you hadn't seen this film for a long time.
No.
And then you saw it perhaps a year ago, I guess. What were what sort of came flooding back when you watched it? I mean, did it remind you of a particular moment in your...
Well, I think the value of COI films from an archival perspective and why it's worthwhile preserving, keeping them and making them more accessible to a wider public is that they do give you, it's like a time capsule. It's an insight into a particular moment in time and in history, which is relatively unfiltered. So I think it's a value in that regard. For me, I mean, I am interested in how they reflect the assumptions of the time. So there's an optimism about them. You know, there's a sense that things are going to go on getting better, and there's a sort of uplifting and forward-looking in a sort of quite unashamed way. I'm afraid we live now in a much more ambiguous, cynical world in some ways, and I find refreshing that sort of the can-do approach of the COI. You don't find that reflected in broadcasting today, or even and public service broadcasting doesn't exist really anymore in that way. So I think there's a lot to be gained from them, just because it helps you reflect on how far we've come in some ways and how far we have fallen in others, which I think is always a good thing to do. I think also it's quite interesting from a sort of a technical, professional point of view. I mean, the men and the women who were behind the camera and writing the scripts were technically very capable. I mean, you sense that. I mean, I was obviously, I was coming into this world. My job was to present, but I just got a profound sense that these were people who you could trust professionally and technically, and they took their job very seriously, and they had a sense of mission and vision, which I think comes through the films, and also the buzz. I mean, I used to love the canteen in Hercules Road, which was the studio where these films, many of them were made, and was a headquarters of the COI. It was a buzzy place, intellectually and in terms of people going about their business. It was there was a lot of ideas, floating around, and lots of animated conversations. I mean, I remember that very, very well. And you found the same in Bush House. I used to go to Bush House when I was a young lawyer to meet Jamoke Dubai, who was one of the presenters of London Line, because it was heavily subsidized. And I didn't have much money. And I knew that I could get a very good lunch there that would cost very little. So I would arrange to meet up with Jamoke so that I could have a good lunch, which, you're 22, 23, and you haven't got much money. That's actually quite important. But in all those places, you had groups of very technically savvy people coming together with a purpose. And that's very precious, and I think it comes through the film. And from all over the world. It's actually quite important to remember that this was at a time when you didn't have black presenters on the TV. This was a place where people like Jamoke and Glenna, myself, and others could actually appear. Because this was a time, believe you me, in Britain, when if there was a black person on the television, your dad would call you in to have a look at them. That it was so rare to see black people on TV at all, let alone as presenters. In fact, I can't recall. You'd see Cy Grant from time to time, Nadia Katous, these great people. But this was before even Trevor McDonald, so this is a long time ago. But at the COI and in Bush House, so at the Central Office of Information and at Bush House, which was the centre of the BBC British Overseas Service, you saw black technicians, black presenters, black programme makers, black filmmakers, and that for a young black guy. At that time, in the early 70s, was for me very important.